Camping alone was something I had done for years. It was the only real escape I had. Out there, deep in the woods, there were no people, no distractions, just me, the quiet, and the feeling of being completely cut off from everything. I liked that. Some people found it lonely, but for me, it was peaceful. That weekend, I had chosen a spot deep in a national forest, miles away from any real campsite. I had hiked in from a gravel road, carrying everything I needed on my back. My tent, food, water, firewood, all of it carefully packed. The hike in had been exhausting, but worth it. The place I found was perfect. A small clearing surrounded by thick trees, not too far from a slow-moving river. The first few hours were great. I set up my tent, got a fire going, and cooked some food. The sun was setting, turning the sky orange and pink between the tree branches. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and insects. I felt at ease. But as night settled in, something changed. It started with a feeling. That off feeling. Like I was being watched. That I tried to ignore it at first. It was normal to feel a little on edge when you were alone in the woods, miles away from anyone. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. At least, that's what I told myself. But then I saw him. At the edge of the firelight, just beyond the trees, a man was standing there. He wasn't moving. Just standing. Watching. I froze. My body tensed, my heart pounding. He was too far away for me to see his face clearly, but I could tell something was off about him. His posture was strange, shoulders hunched, his arms hanging in a way that looked unnatural. His clothes were dirty. His head was tilted slightly, like he was studying me. I felt exposed. I wasn't sure what to do. Then, just as suddenly as I had noticed him, he stepped back into the trees. Gone. I sat there, staring into the darkness where he had been. I listened. The forest had gone quiet. No birds, no insects, just the crackling of my fire and the distant rush of the river. I told myself it was nothing. Just some other camper passing through. Maybe a hunter. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I kept my fire going long into the night. I didn't want to be in the dark. Every so often, I thought I heard something moving in the trees, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, but I never saw him again. Not that night. Footsteps in the dark. I barely slept. Every sound outside my tent kept me awake. At some point, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. But then, in the middle of the night, I woke up. Something was moving outside. I held my breath. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, crunching on leaves, stopping, then starting again. I reached for my knife, gripping it tight. I waited. The footsteps circled my tent. Not an animal. Too heavy. Then they stopped. Right outside. I listened. The air was cold, but I was sweating. Then breathing. Deep, raspy. Right on the other side of the thin fabric. I didn't move. Minutes passed. Then, just as quietly as it had come, the sound faded. The footsteps moved away. I lay there, knife in hand, waiting. I don't know how long I stayed like that. Maybe an hour, maybe more. Eventually, I forced myself to move. Slowly, carefully, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The fire had burned low, but the embers still gave off enough light to see no one was there. But the footprints were circling my tent. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The morning after at first light, I got up and started packing. I wasn't staying another night. As I loaded my gear, I kept looking at the trees, expecting to see him again. And then, I did. He was farther away this time, standing at the edge of the clearing. Watching. In the daylight, I could see him more clearly. His clothes were filthy, torn in places. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, like he hadn't slept in days. He wasn't moving, just standing there. I didn't hesitate. I threw my pack over my shoulder, grabbed my knife, and started walking. Not running. I didn't want him to think I was scared. But I wasn't staying. I made it to the trail, my legs moving faster than they should have. My heart was hammering. The entire way back to my truck, I kept looking over my shoulder. But he never followed. Or at least, I never saw him following. When I reached my truck, I tossed my gear in the back, jumped in, and locked the doors. I sat there for a moment, trying to catch my breath. My hands were shaking. Then, Just before I started the engine, I looked up, and there he was, standing in the tree line. Closer now. Too close that I turned the key and floored it that I didn't stop until I was miles away. The aftermath, I never went back to that spot. Hell, I never went camping alone again. For weeks, I kept looking over my shoulder. At home, at work, everywhere. I don't know who he was. I don't know what he wanted. And the worst part, I think he let me go. I had done for years. It was the only real escape I had. Out there, deep in the woods, there were no people, no distractions, just me, the quiet, and the feeling of being completely cut off from everything. I liked that. Some people found it lonely, but for me, it was peaceful. That weekend, I had chosen a spot deep in a national forest, miles away from any real campsite. I had hiked in from a gravel road, carrying everything I needed on my back. My tent, food, water, firewood, all of it carefully packed. The hike in had been exhausting, but worth it. The place I found was perfect. A small clearing surrounded by thick trees, not too far from a slow-moving river. The first few hours were great. I set up my tent, got a fire going, and cooked some food. The sun was setting, turning the sky orange and pink between the tree branches. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and insects. I felt at ease. But as night settled in, something changed. It started with a feeling, that off feeling, like I was being watched. I tried to ignore it at first. It was normal to feel a little on edge when you were alone in the woods, miles away from anyone. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. At least that's what I told myself. But then I saw him. At the edge of the firelight, just beyond the trees, a man was standing there. He wasn't moving, just standing, watching. I froze, my body tensed, my heart pounding. He was too far away for me to see his face clearly, but I could tell something was off about him. His posture was strange, shoulders hunched, his arms hanging in a way that looked unnatural. His clothes were dirty. His head was tilted slightly, like he was studying me. I felt exposed. I wasn't sure what to do. Then, just as suddenly as I had noticed him, he stepped back into the trees. Gone. I sat there, staring into the darkness where he had been. I listened. The forest had gone quiet. No birds, no insects, just the crackling of my fire and the distant rush of the river. I told myself it was nothing, just some other camper passing through, maybe a hunter. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I kept my fire going long into the night. I didn't want to be in the dark. Every so often, I thought I heard something moving in the trees, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, but I never saw him again. Not that night. I barely slept. Every sound outside my tent kept me awake. At some point, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. But then, in the middle of the night, I woke up. Something was moving outside. I held my breath. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, crunching on leaves, stopping, then starting again. I reached for my knife, gripping it tight. I waited. The footsteps circled my tent. Not an animal. Too heavy. Then they stopped. Right outside. I listened. The air was cold, but I was sweating. Then breathing. Deep, raspy. Right on the other side of the thin fabric. I didn't move. Minutes passed. Then, just as quietly as it had come, the sound faded. The footsteps moved away. I lay there, knife in hand, waiting. I don't know how long I stayed like that. Maybe an hour. Maybe more. Eventually, I forced myself to move. Slowly, carefully, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The fire had burned low, but the embers still gave off enough light to see. No one was there, but the footprints were, circling my tent. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At first light, I got up and started packing. I wasn't staying another night. As I loaded my gear, I kept looking at the trees, expecting to see him again. And then I did. He was farther away this time, standing at the edge of the clearing, watching. In the daylight, I could see him more clearly. His clothes were filthy, torn in places. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, like he hadn't slept in days. He wasn't moving, just standing there. I didn't hesitate. I threw my pack over my shoulder, grabbed my knife and started walking. Not running, I didn't want him to think I was scared. But I wasn't staying. I made it to the trail, my legs moving faster than they should have. My heart was hammering. The entire way back to my truck, I kept looking over my shoulder, but he never followed. Or at least, I never saw him following. When I reached my truck, I tossed my gear in the back, jumped in, and locked the doors. I sat there for a moment, trying to catch my breath. My hands were shaking. Then, just before I started the engine, I looked up, and there he was. I always liked camping alone. It was my way of escaping everything: work, responsibilities, people. Out in the woods, it was just me, the trees, the cold air, and the crackling fire. That kind of silence was rare in my life. So when I finally got a free weekend, I packed my gear, drove out to a remote campsite in the mountains, and set up near a quiet, isolated spot by a lake. It was late September, and the air had a bite to it. Not freezing, but enough that you felt it in your bones when the wind passed through the trees. The forest around me was thick, a mix of evergreens and tall, dry trees with bare branches. The ground was covered in leaves, making every step loud. Perfect. I liked knowing if anything was coming near my camp. By sunset, I had my tent set up, a fire going, and a pot of coffee brewing. It was peaceful. The only sounds were the occasional bird and the distant rustling of wind through the trees. I sat back in my chair, letting the warmth of the fire soak into me. I was content. Then I saw him. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. About 50 yards away, through the trees, a man was standing. He wasn't moving, just standing there, half hidden behind a tree. He was too far away to make out his face, but something about him was off. His posture was strange. Shoulders hunched, head slightly tilted, like he was watching me but trying not to be obvious about it. I stared at him for a long moment. He didn't move. I figured maybe he was just another camper, maybe even a hunter scouting the area. But something about the way he stood there, the way he just stood there, made my skin crawl. I turned my attention back to my fire, forcing myself to ignore him. I wasn't going to let some weird guy ruin my night. After a few minutes, I glanced back toward the trees. He was gone. That should have made me feel better. Didn't. I tried to shake it off. Maybe he was just passing through. Maybe he wasn't even looking at me. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Still, I kept the fire going longer than usual that night, listening carefully to the sounds of the forest. Every crack of a twig, every gust of wind through the leaves felt like something creeping closer. But nothing happened. Eventually, I forced myself to go to bed. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. The fire had burned low, just glowing embers now, casting a faint orange light. The woods were silent. Not a single sound. No wind, no animals. That's what woke me up. The silence. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving just outside my tent. Leaves crunching underfoot. Not an animal too heavy. Person. I held my breath. The steps were circling my tent. My heart hammered in my chest. I reached for my knife, gripping it so tight my hand ached. I wanted to turn on my flashlight, but I didn't want to let whoever was out there know I was awake. The steps stopped. I listened. Nothing. Then, ever so slowly, I heard breathing. Right outside the thin nylon wall of my tent. Shallow. Ragged. Someone was standing inches away, just breathing. I lay there, frozen. What the hell was I supposed to do? If I made a sound, would he run? Or would he do something worse? I waited. Minutes passed. The breathing stayed. Slow. Raspy. Then, just as quietly as it had come, it faded. The footsteps started again, moving away. I stayed awake the rest of the night, knife in hand, listening. At first light, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. My whole body was sore from lying still for hours. The air was cold, but I was sweating. I checked around my campsite. There were footprints in the dirt, circling my tent. They weren't mine. I packed up immediately. I didn't care if I had planned to stay another night. I wasn't staying out here with that thing, that man, creeping around. As I loaded my gear into my truck, I glanced back at the woods. He was there, standing at the tree line, closer this time. I could see his face, pale, eyes too wide, staring straight at me. His mouth was slightly open, lips cracked, like he was trying to speak but couldn't. His clothes were dirty, ripped in places, like he had been out here for weeks, maybe months. I didn't stick around. I got in my truck and drove. I kept looking in my rearview mirror, expecting to see him standing in the road, watching me leave. But he wasn't there. The whole way home, I kept trying to explain it to myself. A lost hiker? A lunatic living in the woods? Some messed up joke? None of it made sense. I didn't go camping alone again after that. I never wanted to go on that trip. It was supposed to be fun, me, my brother, and 2 of our friends heading out into the wilderness for a weekend of camping. We had done it before, but this time something felt off before we even left. I don't know how to explain it. It was just this low, dull anxiety sitting in my chest, like a warning I couldn't understand. I almost told my brother, but he would have just laughed and called me paranoid. We packed up the truck early Friday morning. It was a long drive, hours away from any town, deep into the forest where there was no cell service. That was the whole point, to get away from everything for a few days. Just the 4 of us, a campfire, and the quiet of nature. The drive was uneventful, just miles of empty road and dense trees pressing in from both sides. The deeper we went, the more uneasy I felt. But I didn't say anything. I just sat there, staring out the window, watching the trees blur past. We arrived in the late afternoon. The spot we picked was isolated, right next to a narrow river, with thick woods stretching endlessly behind it. We set up our tents, gathered some firewood, and settled in as the sun started to set. That's when I saw her for the first time. She was standing at the tree line, just far enough away that I couldn't see her face. A woman, tall, thin, wearing a long, dirty dress. She wasn't moving, just standing there, half hidden by the trees. A chill ran through me. I turned to tell my brother, but when I looked back, she was gone. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe a weird-shaped tree, a shadow, something explainable. I pushed it down and tried to enjoy the night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. That night, I didn't sleep well. The others passed out easily, but I lay there, staring at the roof of the tent, listening. The woods were too quiet. No wind, no insects, no rustling leaves, just silence. Then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving just outside the tent. I stopped breathing. My heart was hammering. I wanted to wake my brother, but I was frozen, paralyzed by some deep, instinctive fear. The footsteps stopped. I waited, straining to hear anything. Minutes passed. Then something pressed against the tent wall. Not hard, just enough to make the fabric dip inward, like a hand was pressing against it from the outside. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself not to make a sound. And then nothing. I don't know how long I lay there, but eventually exhaustion took over and I fell into a restless sleep. In the morning, I checked around the tent. No footprints. No sign that anyone had been there. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe I was just freaking myself out. But when I glanced toward the tree line, my stomach dropped. There was something there. A small object, half buried in the dirt. I walked over and picked it up. A button. A small, black button, old and worn, like it had been torn off of something. Something like a long, dirty dress. I swallowed hard, shoving it into my pocket. I didn't tell the others. It sounded crazy even in my own head. We spent the day hiking, fishing, and pretending everything was fine. But I felt watched. Always. Every time I turned around, I expected to see her standing there. And that night, I knew for sure that we were not alone. It was late. The fire was dying down. We were sitting in a loose circle, talking quietly. The air was thick with smoke and the scent of burning wood. Then, without warning, a sharp snap echoed from the darkness. A branch breaking. Close. We all turned. Nothing. Just the empty woods. A few seconds passed. Then another snap. Closer. My brother grabbed the flashlight and pointed it toward the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trunks, the undergrowth, and then, just for a second, something else. A figure, a woman, standing between the trees, just at the edge of the light. Then she was gone. No sound, no movement, just gone. "Did you see that?" My brother's voice was tight, controlled. No one answered. We just stared into the trees, waiting. The fire crackled. The wind shifted. Then, all at once, every single hair on my body stood on end. The smell. It hit me like a wave, thick, rotten, wrong, like something old and dead left out in the sun. "Get in the tents," my brother said quietly. Nobody argued. We scrambled inside, zipping the flaps shut, locking ourselves in thin layers of nylon. I lay there in the dark, barely breathing, listening. Hours passed, and then soft, wet breathing, right outside the tent. Slow, ragged. A shadow moved against the fabric. I squeezed my eyes shut, and then a low, wet whisper. I didn't understand the words, but I understood the intent. A warning. I don't remember falling asleep, but I woke up to sunlight, and something else, something worse. Dozens of buttons. Old, black, worn-down buttons, like she had stood there all night, watching, waiting. We packed up and left immediately. No one spoke. No one looked back. Hours later, when we finally had service, my brother broke the silence. "We're never coming back here." None of us argued, and we never did. I don't know who she was. I don't want to know. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still hear her breathing. I always liked camping. It wasn't just about the fresh air or the sound of nature. It was the feeling of being away from everything. No phones, no streetlights, no noise, just silence and space to think. Maybe that's why I agreed so quickly when my friend, Ryan, suggested a weekend trip to a remote spot in the woods. It was supposed to be a simple, peaceful trip. Just me, Ryan, and another friend, Mark. The location was deep in the mountains, miles away from the nearest town. It was a place Ryan had been to once before, years ago. He said it was perfect, no trails, no campsites, no people. Completely isolated. We had to park the car off an old dirt road and hike in for about 5 miles to get there. That was the whole appeal. No distractions, just the wild. The hike in was rough. The air was thick and humid, and the sun made every step feel heavier. We carried our tents, food, and supplies on our backs. The deeper we got, the more the trees closed in, blocking out the sky. There was no wind, just the sound of our boots crunching on the ground and the occasional call of a bird. Something about the woods felt off. It wasn't anything obvious, just a feeling, like the trees were too close together, like the silence wasn't natural. But I didn't say anything. I didn't want to be that guy, the one who complains about bad vibes. We set up camp near a small clearing by a slow-moving river. The spot was perfect, flat ground, plenty of wood for a fire, and easy access to water. As the sun set, we built a fire, cooked some food, and just sat around talking. Everything felt normal again. The weird feeling from earlier faded. It was just us and the wilderness the way it was supposed to be. But then, as the fire started to die down, we heard something. A sound in the trees behind us. A branch snapping. At first, we thought it was an animal, probably a deer. But then we heard it again. Closer, more deliberate. Not like an animal moving naturally, but like someone stepping carefully through the woods. Ryan shined his flashlight in the direction of the sound, but the beam only hit endless trees. Nothing moved. No eyes reflected back. Just stillness. We sat there for a while, listening, waiting, but nothing else happened. Eventually, we laughed it off. "Probably just a raccoon," Mark said. We let the fire burn out and went to our tents. I woke up in the middle of the night. No reason, just that sudden awareness you get when something isn't right. The tent was stuffy, the air too still. I listened, but there was nothing, just silence. And then a sound, a footstep, slow, careful, close. It was right outside my tent. I held my breath, listened harder. Another step, then another. Someone was out there. I wanted to call out to Ryan and Mark, but something stopped me. A feeling, like if I made a sound, whoever, whatever was outside would know I was awake. I stayed completely still. My heart pounded so hard I was sure they could hear it. The steps moved away, slowly, fading into the trees. I didn't sleep after that. I just lay there, every muscle tense, waiting for the sound to come back. But it never did. At dawn, I got out of my tent, trying to act normal. Ryan and Mark were already up, making coffee. Neither of them said anything about hearing anything weird. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was a dream. But then I saw the footprints. They weren't ours. They were fresh, circling around the campsite. Too big for an animal. Too human. I didn't say anything. I just told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe some hunter had wandered through. Maybe I was just overreacting. But then Mark said it. "Did you guys hear someone walking around last night?" Ryan and I looked at each other. None of us wanted to admit it, but we all had the same feeling now. We weren't alone out here. We tried to shake it off. Packed up for a day of hiking, tried to act like everything was normal. But that feeling never left. The deeper we went into the woods, the worse it got. It wasn't just paranoia anymore. There were signs. Strange things. A deer carcass torn open. The meat stripped from its bones in a way that didn't look natural. Scratches on trees, deep and jagged, like something had been marking its territory. And then there was the sound. A distant, rhythmic tapping, like wood knocking against wood. Faint but steady. We turned back early. None of us said it out loud, but we all felt it. Something was out there. When we got back to camp, something was wrong. The fire pit was disturbed. The logs had been moved. Not scattered, not kicked over, but rearranged. Like someone had been sitting there. Like someone had waited for us to come back. That night, none of us slept. We sat by the fire, listening, waiting, and then we heard it again. Footsteps, but not just one set. More, moving through the trees, circling us. We grabbed our knives, but what were we supposed to do? There were no guns, no way to call for help. Just us, alone in the dark. Then the footsteps stopped. The woods went silent. The fire burned low, casting long shadows. And then, from just beyond the tree line, we saw them. Figures, not animals, not some lost hikers. People, standing, watching, not moving. We didn't speak, didn't breathe. Then, as if on some silent command, they melted back into the woods. Gone. We didn't sleep. We just waited for morning. To first light, we packed up. Fast. We didn't talk. Didn't waste time eating. We just started hiking. The whole way back, we felt them. Not saw them. Not heard them. Felt them. Watching. Following. The car was still there. Nothing had been touched. We threw our gear in, locked the doors, and got the hell out. None of us spoke until we hit the highway. Ryan was the first to break the silence. "We're never coming back here." We all agreed. We never told anyone what happened. Not really. Just vague stories about weird vibes and bad experiences. But we all knew the truth. There was something in those woods. And it wasn't some ghost or monster. It was real. It was human. And it was waiting. I needed to clear my head. That was the excuse I gave myself, anyway. The truth was, I had been feeling restless. Like something was wrong, even though I couldn't put my finger on it. Work was stressful. My apartment felt like a box. And I couldn't remember the last time I had actually enjoyed being around people. So I decided to go camping. Not at some crowded, designated campground. I wanted real solitude. No bathrooms, no picnic tables, no families in RVs blasting music. I wanted to be alone. I found a spot deep in the national forest, about an 8-mile hike from the nearest road. There were no marked trails leading there, just an old fire road and miles of dense, untouched forest. I mapped out my route, packed enough food and water for 3 days, and told my brother where I'd be. Just a general location, since there were no specific trails to follow. I didn't expect to see a single person the entire time. That was the whole point. I had no idea how wrong I was. The drive was uneventful, miles of empty highway, then another hour on a dirt road that felt more abandoned than official. By the time I reached the fire road, the forest was thick, untouched. No signs of people, no cars. I parked, pulled on my pack, locked the doors, and started hiking. The first few miles were easy, just following the overgrown road. The only sounds were my boots crunching on the gravel and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. But the deeper I went, the quieter the forest became. I didn't notice it at first. It was subtle, like the air itself was growing heavier. The birds stopped calling, the insects weren't buzzing, and the only thing I could hear was my own breathing. At around the 5-mile mark, I found something strange. A campsite, or rather, the remains of one. There was a tent, half collapsed, weather-beaten, with the fabric torn like something had ripped through it. A backpack, dumped on the ground, partially unzipped. And the weirdest part? A pair of shoes sitting neatly next to the fire pit. Not tossed, not abandoned mid-stride, placed like someone had just stepped out of them. My stomach twisted, but I told myself there was a rational explanation. Maybe a hunter left it behind. Maybe some hiker got lost and never came back for their stuff. Still, it felt wrong. I kept walking. By late afternoon, I reached my spot. A small clearing near a slow-moving river, surrounded by thick trees. It was beautiful, isolated, exactly what I wanted. I set up camp fast, pitching my tent, collecting firewood, and making sure everything was just right before the sun set. But that feeling hadn't gone away. That strange silence. I sat by the fire, eating my dinner, listening, trying to force myself to relax. But every so often, I caught myself glancing at the trees, like I was expecting to see something standing there, watching, waiting. But there was nothing, just shadows, just my own paranoia, or so I thought. I woke up to a sound. At first, I wasn't sure if I had imagined it. Then a snap, a branch breaking, close. I held my breath, my body stiff with adrenaline. Then another snap. This time, I was awake enough to know what I was hearing. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling my tent. I reached for my knife, gripping the handle so tight my knuckles ached. My mind was racing. Bear? No, a bear would be louder. A bear wouldn't walk like that. Deer? No. Then what? Or worse, who? I listened, trying not to breathe too loudly. Then nothing. The footsteps stopped. I lay there for what felt like hours, waiting for them to come back. They didn't. Eventually, exhaustion won. I fell into a restless sleep. Morning came and everything looked normal. No footprints, no broken branches, no signs of anything. For a moment, I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. Then, as I was making breakfast, I saw something small, something that made my stomach drop. My food bag, it was gone. I had hung it in a tree, far out of reach of animals. But now the rope was still there, swinging empty. My first thought, person took it. I scanned the area, searching the ground for any sign of movement. Then I saw it. A footprint, bare, not mine, and fresh. My pulse hammered in my ears. Someone had been here, watching me, and they had taken my food. My first instinct was to leave immediately, but I was miles from my truck, with no quick way out. I told myself I'd stay one more night, but I'd sleep lightly, and if anything else happened, I'd leave before sunrise. I spent the day on edge, every snap of a branch making my skin crawl. By sunset, I had built my fire bigger than before, gripping my knife, listening, waiting. At some point, I must have dozed off by the fire, because I woke up to a sound. A new sound, breathing, slow, heavy. Right behind me, my stomach turned to ice. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows. And then I saw it, a figure, standing just at the edge of the firelight. Not moving, just watching me. I lunged for my flashlight, snapped it on. Nothing. The figure was gone. I grabbed my gear in a frenzy, not caring about packing properly. I was done. I kicked dirt over the fire, threw my pack over my shoulder, and started hiking in the dark. Every few minutes, I checked over my shoulder. Every few minutes, I saw nothing, but I felt it. I wasn't alone. Something was following me the whole way. The moment I reached my truck, I threw my pack in the back, locked the doors, and floored it. As I peeled away, my headlights swept across the tree line, and for a split second, I saw it. A man, standing motionless, just beyond the trees, watching me leave. I didn't stop. I didn't breathe until I was back on the highway, and I never went camping alone again. There's something about being alone in the woods that's supposed to be peaceful. No noise, no people, no distractions. Just silence. A place where your thoughts can stretch out and breathe. That's what I wanted. I had been drowning in work for months, stuck in an endless loop of deadlines, emails, and stress. I needed a break, a real one. So I planned a solo camping trip. I wasn't new to it. I had done plenty of solo hikes before, spent nights deep in the wilderness without a second thought. This was supposed to be the same. I picked a remote spot, one far away from the usual trails, deep inside a national forest. It wasn't an official campsite, but that's what I wanted, true isolation. No cell service, no people, just me and the quiet. I packed light but smart tent, sleeping bag, enough food and water, my knife, a small hatchet, and a first aid kit. I double-checked my map, marked my route, and let my brother know where I'd be, just in case. Then I got in my truck and drove. I didn't know I was heading straight into something I wouldn't come back from the same. The drive was uneventful, just miles of empty highway and thick forests stretching endlessly on either side. I reached the turnoff, a barely visible dirt road that wound its way deeper into the trees. After half an hour of bumping over rocks and potholes, I parked where the road ended. No other cars. Good. I pulled on my pack, checked my gear, and started hiking. The first few miles were perfect. The forest was thick and alive. Birds calling overhead, the crunch of leaves under my boots, the distant sound of running water. I felt good. The stress of the city, of work, of everything. I could feel it peeling away with every step. After about 2 hours, I reached my spot. A clearing near a small river, surrounded by dense trees, far from any trails. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and sat by the water, letting the sound of the current fill the silence in my head. Felt right, but then things started to feel off. I just didn't know it yet. That night, I sat by the fire, eating a simple meal, staring up at the sky. The stars were brighter out here, untouched by city lights. It was the kind of peace I had been craving. But something was wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. Then I realized the forest had gone silent. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just nothing. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath. I told myself it was normal, that sometimes the woods just went quiet. But I couldn't shake the feeling creeping into my chest. The feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept the fire going longer than usual, just in case. When I finally crawled into my tent, I made sure my knife was within reach, just in case. I woke up to a sound, a branch snapping, close. I held my breath, listening. Then soft footsteps, not an animal, person, circling my tent. I stayed still, my heart hammering in my chest. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination. Then I heard breathing, low, controlled, right outside the thin layer of fabric. I gripped my knife, every muscle in my body tense. The breathing stopped. Silence. Then another step, closer, and then nothing. The footsteps just faded away into the trees. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping my knife, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. When the first light broke through the trees, I unzipped my tent and stepped out. Everything looked normal, but I wasn't stupid. Someone had been out there, watching, waiting, and they weren't done. I should have left, but I didn't. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I forced myself to go about my day. I fished in the river, gathered more firewood, tried to act like I wasn't afraid. But the feeling never went away. That prickling at the back of my neck, like eyes were on me. By late afternoon, I had made up my mind. I was leaving first thing in the morning. I packed up most of my gear, keeping only what I needed for the night. Then I noticed something. My food bag was gone. I had hung it from a high branch, far out of reach of animals. Now it was just gone. No torn wrappers, no scattered food, just gone. I stared up at the empty branch, my stomach twisting into a knot. Someone had taken it. Someone had come into my camp. I built my fire big that night. I sat with my back to my tent, my knife in my lap, staring into the trees, waiting, listening. I didn't sleep, and at some point in the early hours of the morning, I heard it, a soft, deliberate laugh, not close, but not far enough, a sound that sent pure, ice-cold terror through me, because it wasn't happy, it was mocking. I didn't wait until morning. I grabbed my gear, kicked dirt over the fire, and started hiking, fast. The whole way I felt it, following. At one point, I heard footsteps behind me, matching mine. Then, just as the trailhead came into sight, they stopped, like they knew I was leaving, like they had been playing a game and now the game was over. I reached my truck, threw my gear inside, and locked the doors. I sat there for a long moment, my hands shaking. Then, as I was about to start the engine, I saw something in the trees. A figure, tall, motionless, just standing there, watching me. I didn't wait. I peeled out of there, my tires kicking up gravel. I didn't look back, because I knew if I had stayed one more night, I wouldn't have left at all. I never went back. I don't go camping alone anymore. And sometimes, in the deep silence of the night, I still hear it, that soft, deliberate laugh, somewhere out in the dark, waiting. I needed this trip. I had spent the last 6 months stuck in a routine that made me feel like I was suffocating. Work, home, sleep, repeat. The walls of my apartment felt like they were closing in. I was tired of the noise, the traffic, the constant hum of the city. So I planned a trip into the woods. Not just a normal camping trip, a deep, off-the-grid escape. No campgrounds, no trails filled with weekend hikers. Just me, my gear, and miles of untouched wilderness. I found a spot after hours of researching maps. A remote section of national forest, miles away from any designated campsites. There was an old logging road leading into it, barely visible on satellite images, but it looked passable. That was exactly what I wanted, true isolation. I packed my truck with everything I needed. Tent, food, water, first aid, my knife, a small hatchet, and my rifle. I wasn't expecting trouble, but you don't go that deep into the woods unprepared. It was a 4-hour drive to the logging road, then another hour of bouncing over ruts and rocks, my truck groaning with every dip. The deeper I went, the more the trees swallowed me. No cell service, no road signs, just forest in every direction. When the road finally ended, I parked in a small clearing. No other vehicles, no signs of people. Perfect. I pulled on my pack, locked the truck, and started hiking. The trail I followed wasn't really a trail, just an old overgrown path, barely recognizable. The deeper I went, the quieter everything became. At first, it felt peaceful. Just the sound of my boots crunching on leaves, the distant rush of a stream. But after a while, something started to feel off. It was that feeling you get when you walk into a room and someone's already there, except I was miles from anyone. I kept moving, telling myself I was just adjusting to the silence. The city never let me hear my own thoughts like this. By late afternoon, I reached my spot, a flat area near a slow-moving river, surrounded by dense trees. I set up camp, started a fire, and sat by the water, letting the tension bleed out of my body. But that feeling, it never fully left. That night, I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, letting my mind drift. The stars overhead were brighter than I'd ever seen, a thick band stretching across the sky. It should have been perfect. Then the forest went silent. One moment, there were the normal sounds: crickets, rustling leaves, distant hoots of an owl. The next, nothing, not even the wind. I sat up, my skin prickling. I knew that sometimes the woods just did that. Predators moved through, and the smaller creatures went quiet. But this silence felt wrong. Felt like something was watching. I grabbed my rifle, keeping it close. I told myself it was just my nerves. After an hour, the normal sounds slowly returned. I forced myself into my tent, zipped it up tight, and tried to sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. Something was moving outside. Slow, deliberate. Not an animal, a person. The sound circled my tent, stopping every few steps. Listening, I held my breath, gripping my knife so hard my hand ached. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I lay there for what felt like hours, waiting for something, anything to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, the exhaustion won. I fell asleep. The next morning, I stepped out of my tent, my body stiff from sleeping in fear. Everything looked normal. But then I noticed something. My food bag was gone. I had hung it from a tree branch, far out of reach of animals. But now the rope dangled empty. No torn packaging, no scattered crumbs, just gone. My stomach twisted. A bear would have left a mess. A raccoon wouldn't have been able to reach it. But a person could have cut it down, taken it. I looked around, scanning the tree line. Nothing. I told myself it was probably an animal, but I didn't believe it. I spent the day fishing, trying to shake the unease, trying to ignore the feeling that I wasn't alone. But it was impossible. Every few minutes, I'd hear something. A twig snapping, leaves rustling, just outside my view. By evening, I had made up my mind. I was leaving in the morning. That night, I built my fire bigger than before. I sat with my back to my tent, rifle across my lap, staring into the trees, waiting, listening. The silence came again, thick, suffocating. Then footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the camp. My heart pounded. I gripped my rifle tighter, my finger hovering over the trigger. Then, a laugh, low, soft, close, too close. A cold, mocking chuckle from the darkness. I lifted my rifle, aiming blindly into the trees. Nothing. I sat there for hours, my body rigid, my skin crawling. The footsteps never came closer. The laugh never repeated, but I never heard them leave. The first light, I packed my gear fast. I didn't eat. I didn't even bother taking down my tent. I just grabbed what I could and started hiking. Every few minutes, I'd glance over my shoulder. The feeling never left me. I wasn't alone. The whole hike back, I felt something just beyond the trees, watching, following. I picked up my pace. Then, finally, the truck. I threw my gear inside, locked the doors, and started the engine, my hands shaking. As I pulled away, I looked into the rearview mirror, and I saw it, a figure standing just at the tree line, tall, motionless, watching me leave. I didn't stop. I didn't breathe until I hit the highway. I never reported it. I never told anyone, but I never went camping alone again. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still hear it, that low, deliberate laugh, waiting. I needed time away. The last few months had been exhausting. Work had piled up, my apartment felt suffocating, and I was drained in every possible way. I had always found peace in the wilderness, away from people, away from noise. So I planned a solo camping trip. Just 3 days. A simple retreat into the woods. No service, no distractions, just me and the quiet. I picked a spot deep in the national forest, far from the main trails. I had researched a few possible clearings, ones that were near a stream and had enough space for my tent. It wasn't an official campsite, but that was the point. I wanted to be completely alone. I packed my gear carefully, double-checked my supplies, and told my brother the general area I'd be in. I knew these woods well. I had camped alone plenty of times before. I wasn't worried. I should have been. I left early Friday morning, the highway stretching empty ahead of me. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sun was climbing high, warming the cool morning air. There were no other cars in the small gravel lot. Good. I shouldered my pack and started walking. The first few miles were easy, just a well-worn dirt path winding through towering trees. Birds chirped, the breeze rustled the leaves, and I felt my shoulders relax for the first time in weeks. After about 4 miles, I left the marked trail. I had mapped out a route ahead of time, following an old, overgrown fire road that hadn't been used in years. It was slow-going, thick underbrush, uneven ground, but after another hour, I found the clearing. It was perfect, flat ground, surrounded by trees, with a narrow stream running along one edge. I dropped my pack and took a deep breath. No traffic noise, no people, just silence. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and took a short walk to get a better feel for the area. That's when I saw the first sign that something was wrong. A campsite, old, abandoned, torn pieces of tarp clinging to low branches, half buried in the dirt. A rusted-out camp stove sitting near the fire pit. It looked like it had been there for years, but something felt off. There were shoes still in the dirt, a backpack with its straps torn, sitting open, empty. It wasn't just abandoned. It looked like someone had left in a hurry. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the scene. Then I told myself I was overthinking it. People leave old campsites behind all the time. Maybe it had been a storm, maybe an animal had scattered things. I shook off the unease and went back to my own camp. By the time the sun started setting, I had pushed it from my mind. That night, as I sat by the fire, listening to the crackling wood and the distant sound of running water, I felt safe. But I wasn't. I woke up to a sound. First, I thought I was dreaming. Then I heard it again. A branch snapping. Close. My breath caught in my throat. I lay still, listening. Silence. Then another snap. I reached for my knife, my fingers tightening around the handle. I told myself it was an animal. A deer, maybe, but something felt wrong. I listened for minutes, every nerve in my body alert, but the woods stayed silent. Too silent. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep, but I never fully relaxed. The next morning was wrong. The woods felt different. I couldn't explain it, but the air was heavier, the silence deeper. I tried to shake it off. I spent the day exploring, taking photos, fishing by the stream. But every time I looked up, I had the same feeling, that someone was watching me. I checked my camp over and over, making sure nothing had been moved. Everything was where I had left it, but my gut told me something was off. And then, as I was gathering more firewood, I found it. A footprint, not mine, deep in the mud near the stream. A single, bare footprint, large, human. I stood there, heart hammering. I wasn't alone. Someone else was out here, watching. I turned, scanning the trees. Nothing, just shadows. But I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't paranoid. I knew with absolute certainty that someone had been near my camp. Maybe they still were. I forced myself to stay calm. I hiked back quickly, trying not to look over my shoulder. When I got to camp, I did a full check of my gear. Nothing was missing, but the unease wouldn't leave me. That night, I built my fire higher. I kept my knife close. I listened, and as the hours passed, I started to think. Maybe I was just imagining things. Maybe the footprint was old. Maybe I was letting the isolation get to me. Maybe, until I woke up again, to breathing, right outside my tent. I stopped breathing. I gripped my knife so hard my knuckles ached. The breathing was slow, deliberate, not an animal, person, standing right outside my tent. I stayed frozen, my mind racing. I thought about unzipping the tent, lunging out, but what if they were armed? What if they were waiting for me to move? I didn't move, for what felt like hours. Eventually, the breathing stopped. I waited longer, listening, then soft footsteps, moving away, fading into the trees. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in the darkness, gripping my knife, waiting for sunrise. The second there was enough light, I packed my gear in a frenzy. I didn't eat. I didn't even take down my tent. I just grabbed what I could and started hiking, fast. The whole time I felt them, watching, following. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. Not when I heard the rustling in the trees. Not when I swore I saw something move in the corner of my eye. Not even when I saw the old campsite again and realized the shoes were gone. By the time I reached my car, I was drenched in sweat. I threw my gear in the back, locked the doors, and drove. I didn't breathe easy until I hit the highway. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But I know this. They were waiting. And if I had stayed one more night, I don't think I would have made it out. I needed a break. City life was wearing me down. The noise, the crowds, the endless cycle of work and sleep. I wanted silence, somewhere remote, somewhere I could breathe without feeling the weight of the world pressing against my skull. So I planned a solo camping trip. 3 days, no phone service, no people, just me, my gear, and the quiet of the woods. I picked a national forest about 4 hours from home. I had hiked there before, but I chose a spot far from the marked trails this time. A small clearing by a river, about 6 miles off the main path. I told my brother where I was going, sent him my planned route, and packed everything I needed. I thought I had covered all my bases. I thought I was prepared. But no one is ever really prepared for the moment they realize they're being hunted. The drive was easy, a straight shot down empty highways, through miles of nothing but trees and farmland. I reached the trailhead just after noon. There were a few cars parked in the gravel lot, but no people in sight. The air was crisp, the scent of pine strong after recent rain. The first part of the hike was peaceful, just the crunch of my boots on the dirt trail, the distant rush of wind through the trees. After about 4 miles, I left the main trail. The terrain became rougher, the underbrush thick, but I took my time, checking my GPS and map to stay on course. By late afternoon, I found the clearing. It was perfect, flat ground, a good tree for hanging my food, and the river was only a short walk away. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and settled in. I should have noticed the signs then. The unnatural quiet, the lack of animal tracks, the way the trees seemed to close in around me. But I didn't, not yet. By sunset, my camp was set. I sat by the fire, eating a simple meal, letting the stillness wash over me. First, it was relaxing, but then I noticed something. The woods weren't just quiet. They were dead. No birds, no insects, no rustling of small animals in the brush. Just the crackle of my fire and the low murmur of the river. I told myself it was nothing. Some nights were just like that. Still, a weight settled in my chest, a feeling I couldn't shake. I kept the fire burning longer than I normally would, just in case. When I finally crawled into my tent, I made sure my knife was within reach, just in case. I woke up to a sound. At first, I wasn't sure if I had imagined it. Then a snap, a branch breaking. Close. I froze, heart hammering. Then another snap. Closer. My mind raced. Deer? Bear? Then I heard something that sent ice through my veins. Breathing. Slow. Shallow. Right outside my tent. I gripped my knife, barely daring to breathe. The breathing stopped. For a long time, there was silence. Then, I heard soft footsteps, circling my tent. Deliberate. Human. I didn't move. The steps circled once, then again, then nothing. I stayed awake the rest of the night, knife in hand, eyes locked on the tent flap, waiting. But the footsteps never returned. And when dawn finally came, I stepped outside to find my camp exactly as I left it. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign that anyone or anything had been there. But I knew what I had heard, and I knew I wasn't alone. I should have left. But I didn't. I told myself it was paranoia, that my mind was playing tricks on me. So I forced myself to go about my day. I hiked to the river, filled my water bottle, even took a short swim to clear my head. But the feeling never went away. The feeling of being watched. Every time I glanced at the tree line, I expected to see something. Something standing there, just out of sight. By late afternoon, my nerves were shot. I decided I would leave first thing in the morning. I started packing early, stuffing my gear back into my pack, making sure everything was in place. Then I noticed something. My food bag was gone. I always hung it in a tree, high enough that animals couldn't reach. Now it was just gone. I searched the area, but it wasn't on the ground. No sign of torn packaging, no shredded wrappers. It hadn't been dragged away. It had been taken. That night, I built the biggest fire I could. I sat with my back to my tent, knife in my lap, waiting. The woods were silent, but I knew I wasn't alone. At some point, exhaustion won. I must have dozed off. I woke up to the sound of something moving in my camp. Slow, careful, right behind me. I turned, heart slamming against my ribs. The fire had burned low. The trees loomed tall, casting deep shadows. And then I saw it, a figure, standing at the edge of the firelight, motionless, just watching me. Couldn't see a face, just the outline of a person, tall, thin, barely visible in the darkness. My breath caught in my throat. I reached for my knife. The figure didn't move. Then it took a step forward. Something snapped inside me. I lunged for my pack, grabbed my flashlight, and shined it toward the figure. Nothing, just empty woods. The figure was gone, but I didn't imagine it. I know what I saw. I didn't wait. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my pack, kicked dirt over the fire, and ran. The whole way, I felt eyes on me. At one point, I heard footsteps behind me, soft, careful, matching my pace. I ran faster. I didn't stop until I saw my car in the distance. I fumbled with the keys, threw my pack in the back seat, locked the doors, and peeled out of there as fast as I could. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see what was behind me. I never went back. I never told anyone. But sometimes at night, when I close my eyes, I see it. That figure, standing just beyond the firelight, waiting. And I wonder, what would have happened if I had stayed one more night?